Hello, I'm Harley Schlanger. Welcome to our weekly dialogue with Helga Zepp-LaRouche, the founder and chairwoman of the Schiller Institute. It's September 2nd, 2001. Helga, you've been emphasizing repeatedly in recent weeks that we're now at the point where a phase shift is taking place in the world. We saw somewhat of a recognition of that in President Biden's comments the other day that the era of using military for regime change is over. Where do things stand as far as this question of a shift to a new era?
Well, there are many different reactions to the fact. I mean, first of all, I think it is quite noteworthy that President Biden not only declared the Afghanistan mission for ended, but the whole era of nation building. Now, that word needs to be looked at a little bit closer because what these people called nation building had nothing to do with nation building or building a nation. It's sort of a word, a syllogism for regime change, humanitarian intervention, trying to remodel foreign countries after a military intervention according to the value system of the liberal West. And it is very clear that that model has completely, utterly failed. As a matter of fact, there is a general recognition that that is the case. 20 years for nothing, or for actually, with a lot of people dead, a lot of people displaced. But there is not yet real recognition. I mean, there are different reactions. For example, what I'm right now most concerned with is that while it is clear that, the United States, the British, NATO in general, they want to abandon these interventionist wars like Afghanistan, Iraq, possibly even Syria. But there is unfortunately a change to concentrate on the real competition, as they say, namely Russia and China, and there in particular China, and a shift to the Pacific. Now, if that would be the only lesson learned out of this disaster, we are not much better off, because the aim, or the idea that the West can contain the rise of China is an idea which is equally destined to fail, like the Afghanistan war was, however, with even much greater consequences, because as we see around the conflict with Taiwan, the potential that such a confrontation could lead to a nuclear war is unfortunately very high. And you had a couple of months ago many military leaders and also other individuals warning that that danger is very high. So I think that we should absolutely not have, but that is still on the agenda. Now, looking at the Afghanistan situation as such, I think there are also very different reactions. The British are completely freaked out that Biden did not consult with them, that he did not inform them. There are now, articles in the Financial Times and in the New York Times who equate Biden with Trump. I find this very, almost, if the situation wouldn't be so serious, I would almost laugh and find it very ironic. Yeah, they're accusing now Biden of being pro-Irish, anti-British. So all of this is going on. So the British are generally freaked out because they know that the so-called global Britain without the United States is just two empty words with nothing behind it. Then naturally, the US military, you have some people in the military, and there's actually a group which has formed, I think, around Petraeus, blasting Biden that this was the biggest mistake, that the US should stay there forever. Now, these are the cement heads, as we would have called them, around the fall of the wall, the Betonköpfe, those people who are not willing to learn anything no matter what. But there are also, I would say, honest military who were in that, and they are completely, at a loss, because they do not understand really what went wrong, and so there are all these different reactions. And I think what is still absolutely lacking is a fundamental recognition and analysis of what went wrong. Why is it that this Western effort to remodel the world according to, right to protect, humanitarian intervention, to impose so-called Western democracy into countries which have a completely different culture. I mean, Afghanistan, for that matter, was not, the British were not able to conquer it in the 19th century with three efforts. The Soviets were not able to do it. And now NATO and, the strongest military power on the planet, the United States, was not able to do it. So maybe there should be a lesson once and for all that the idea of humanitarian interventions and trying to impose, sort of proselytizing Western values does not work. So that is the first lesson, but that is just the first step. And the second step naturally has to be what instead. In the case of Afghanistan, the United States spent $2 trillion in 20 years. The Council of Foreign Relations even claims it was $2.3 trillion. Germany spent altogether 18 billion euros, and the result is abysmal. What is the result? Afghanistan has now 14 million people starving. According to David Beasley, the head of the World Food Program, 500,000 people are displaced. 4 million are in danger of dying this year if there is not a major change in the policy, including food aid. So this is an abysmal result. Obviously, this money was very badly spent. So I think that what is really required, and this is an appeal to you, our viewers, to help in causing this, what is really required is a fundamental analysis of what went wrong in Afghanistan, but also Iraq, Syria, Libya, and all the other major interventions, because unless one has a first clarity about that, you cannot correct the mistakes.
There's so many ironies here. I just want to point to a couple. One is people who are saying we should keep troops in there. We shouldn't have left because ISIS and Al Qaeda are going to emerge. Well, ISIS and Al Qaeda have been there. They're still there. When we had troops, they were still there. So the idea that more troops simply means that they're clinging to the idea that there can be a military solution. And that has a lot to do with the huge amounts of money that end up going into the hands of the Beltway consultants and so on. The other thing that I find completely ironic is people who are saying we should have stayed to defend the rights of the Afghan people. Well, now, as you point out, there are millions facing starvation. And yet the same people who are saying we should defend them are withholding funds. I mean, you have some, I think, a report on the amount of money that's being withheld from Afghanistan.
Yeah, the US Federal Reserve is withholding, I think, $9 billion worth of assets belonging to Afghanistan. And they claim that, since they don't recognize the Taliban as the legitimate government, they are withholding this money. The IMF is withholding 400 million in terms of special drawing rights. And, so basically it comes down as a financial warfare. And the Taliban on the other side have expressed very clearly that they want to establish a full-fledged financial system. And I think it is very important. I mean, the Taliban may not be what some people prefer, obviously not. But the real terrorism threat at this point comes not from the Taliban, it comes from ISIS, Al Qaeda, and other terrorist groups, which immediately will emerge as the much bigger threat if the Taliban would get thrown into chaos because of this financial warfare. So the Taliban has also expressed very clearly that they are very interested in economic reconstruction of the country, and that is the only way. I mean, our position, we had the foresight, to have a very comprehensive event with the Schiller Institute on the 31st of July, prescribing exactly what kind of reconstruction economic program is needed. And that is still the blueprint, essentially, of what needs to be done. So I find it very good and very interesting that the Russian ambassador to Afghanistan, Kabulov, is demanding the unfreezing of these assets as the first step. I think the German participation in not only the humanitarian aid, but also what they call development aid, which was certain projects which are now discontinued, must continue. I mean, it's stupid. The worst thing you can do right now is add to the economic instability of a country where half of the population is going hungry every day. It can only lead to chaos, and the terrorists will win because, whoever wants to destabilize the situation will have a much, much easier time to do so if people are at the starvation level. Kabulov also demanded the conducting of an immediate international conference to discuss what kinds of development projects would be needed to start the serious economic development. And I can only endorse that. We have already basically outlined in rough terms exactly the kind of projects, corridors, infrastructure, and above all, we have to start with building a modern health system, because apart from the starvation, naturally, Afghanistan is hit, like all the other countries, with the COVID-19 crisis. And therefore, if you want to show a sign of goodwill from the side of the West, the best thing to do would be to say, we offer the building of several modern hospitals, the training programs for doctors, nurses, young people to assist that. And we are willing to cooperate with Russia, with China, Pakistan, India, and the neighbor countries of Central Asia in the stabilization and will uplift the economy of Afghanistan as the very first step, according to the principle, peace is development. I think, if those people who are now so freaked out about that this was the biggest failure of the West, they should, rather than just continuing geopolitical machinations, they should really change. Not military operation, but economic cooperation is what wins the peace. So that will be our forceful intervention in the next period.
Now, just to take that a little further, you have Blinken making the statement that the military has failed. Now we have to move to diplomacy. Now that leaves a very wide open question. You have the CIA director, William Burns, in his book, The Back Channel, actually made the point that the diplomacy has fallen victim to the idea of using military force, and made a very interesting statement about the US acting more like the British colonial service than the traditional American foreign colony service, rather. But at the same time, Blinken seems to be continuing to push the pivot to Asia. And instead of working with China, which would be the obvious point, which you've called for, it still appears as though there's a buildup in the South China Sea, the idea of an Asian NATO. What's your sense of where things stand with this?
Well, as I said, if the only lesson to be learned is leave these interventionist wars in the so-called small countries to concentrate on the big ones, namely Russia and China, nothing essential is gained. And I think very interesting is a statement by Mr. Lomanov, the head of the Primakov Institute of the Russian Academy of Science, who basically discusses, in the context of Afghanistan, the collapse of the so-called soft power of the United States. Now, I find this very interesting because, obviously, when in the Cold War period, immediately in the post-war period, Germany and Japan, the previous enemies, at a certain point, because of geopolitical reasons, there was a shift to allow for the reconstruction of these two former enemies. And, Germany and Japan both enjoyed relative prosperity as a result of that shift. Now, none of the so-called small powers, which were destroyed by these military interventions, have been rebuilt. Iraq is still a catastrophe. Syria is in a horrendous situation, especially because of the ongoing Caesar sanctions. Libya is still a complete mess. Yemen is starving. Now, Afghanistan is half of the population is on a starvation level. Now, there must be prosperity. And the head of the Primakov Institute basically points to the fact, that the lack or the inability of providing prosperity to these small countries is the real bottleneck. This is why China is so much more attractive to all of these developing countries, because if you have the choice to be either the aircraft carrier in the Pacific for the United States or to enjoy infrastructure development, then the answer is very clear. All of these countries rather go with the Chinese approach than with the US, which just is putting the emphasis on the military thing. So I think the West must have a serious reflection of why the idea of an unipolar world where the European Union is sort of the junior partner of the Anglo-American special relationship, that is over. And I think the Burns book you mentioned has this interesting idea, an admission that this unipolar role of the United States was a short-term, temporary role, and by the nature of things cannot be maintained. And I think the West seriously has to shift gears, go back to the idea of development, real development. For example, in the 50s and the 60s, you had the UN development decades, where the idea was that every 10 years you would review the situation with the idea to overcome underdevelopment of the developing countries for good. And that has to be put back on the table. And then you have to have a new paradigm where geopolitical confrontation has to be replaced with the idea of cooperation. The world is so full of problems that even if you have economic development coming from China, from Asian countries, from European countries, from the United States, to uplift the world out of its present horrendous condition, it will take many, many years of international cooperation, and hopefully the human race will become adult and we will learn to live together with different social systems, respecting each other's sovereignty, and live in peace. We are not beasts, we are not bears or foxes or other animals who get hungry and then become predatory on the other kind. We are human beings, and we can together populate space. We can eradicate poverty. We can find an answer to any problem if we work together for the common good. And I think that shift has to occur. I know it's very far from what people are now regarding as their motivation, but that is the species jump, so to speak, which has to occur if we really want to have a bright future.
Now, one other area where geopolitics has once again reared its ugly head is Ukraine, where the president of Ukraine has been visiting Washington. There's talk about an aggressive Russia having to teach them a lesson. This is going to continue to come up. Where does Europe stand on this? Is Europe going to continue to go along with NATO and the US on this, or will there be a break?
Well, I mean, there are certain statements, for example, by Michel from the European Parliament, others who say, that this whole Afghanistan departure, the chaotic withdrawal without, informing the allies, there's a lot of criticism of Biden, how the withdrawal was done. And admittedly, there were some things which were really not exactly heroic. And now some people say you can't trust the United States anymore, therefore Europe must become more assertive. Now that's again, that's on the one side, I think it is true. The United States has, not exactly been cooperative with Europe as equal partners, and you have to draw your consequences out of that. But on the other side, it's no good if you replace unipolar dominated geopolitics with a multipolar geopolitics. You have to get rid of geopolitics. And I think that step still requires some work, but that is exactly what the Schiller Institute is trying to put on the agenda internationally, that you have to have a different conception of what foreign policy is all about. Namely, you have to work in the interest of the other if you want to accomplish your own interest.
Now, it's clear that what you're talking about as a program for global economic development would appeal to young people in particular who are looking to what they're going to do with the rest of their lives. But there's a huge effort to rope the young into the Green New Deal and to get them to turn on the older generation, turn on technology. This is now, this green disease is everywhere. What's the latest indications you have of just how bad this is going?
Well, I mean, there are many voices that the famous Glasgow COP26 meeting beginning of November in Scotland, that will be a flop. And that is basically because, it's very clear the EU and also the Biden administration were, using this climate change cooperation to somehow get Russia and China and the developing countries on board. But these countries are not stupid. Given the fact that there had been a breakdown of all cooperation, when John Kerry just went to China to discuss with Wang Yi, the China-US cooperation on climate change, Wang Yi had a very interesting response. He said, the cooperation on climate change cannot be an oasis in a desert. Meaning there have to be many areas of cooperation, not just that luring China into its own self-destruction, which is clearly what the Green Deal would bring about. Then the new Chinese ambassador in the United States, Qin Gang, he said that the US-China relations is at a historic juncture, and that it absolutely must not be driven to a new Cold War and beyond. So I think also the Russians have never said very clearly that they do not agree with this whole IPCC interpretation of the climate change, but de facto, they're building nuclear plants, they're building coal plants, as does China. India has clearly rejected the COP26, and so I think it's one of these points. What young people should rather realize than falling for this propaganda, which is opposed by thousands of scientists. We had a very good representation on one of the Schiller conferences in end of I think it was in July. Representing scientists from Italy, Switzerland, Holland, Germany, the United States, many other countries, South Africa. If I would be a young person, I would really think about, where do we stand? We have the end of an entire system, because I think what we see in terms of the, failure of the West to accomplish their aims, if you add to that the cultural, crisis, if you are a young person, you may not necessarily think it's a crisis, but it is the fact that the United States life expectancy is collapsing since, I think, 4 years in a row, that is the strongest economic indicator about a collapsing system. The suicide rates, the drug addiction, the school shootings, the entire idea that you can ask young children if they want to be a boy or a girl. I mean, these children are much too young to have the idea about the consequences of what it means to have these discussions, even the discussion, leave alone medical consequences. So there are a whole bunch of things which are going wrong in our present society. And if you contrast that with China, well, some people in the West will freak out and say this is another proof of the dictatorship China. But what China is just promoting, and I think it's Xi Jinping personally, they want to limit the time youth can watch or play games on the internet to 3 hours per week, with the argument that children and students should concentrate on their education and not waste their time with gaming. Now, if you think about and they compared the gaming with a spiritual addiction, comparing it deliberately and explicitly to the addiction of the opium wars, when China was under attack in the 19th century. And they say that the reason why they're doing is they want to have a society of engineers, of scientists, of teachers, of artists, and not of game addicts. Now, I think this is absolutely the right thing to do because, as the whole legalization of dope, which is going on a rampage in the United States, it does have a very negative on the cognitive powers of the mind. And, if you just look at these different developments, I think it is very clear which system will survive and which system is undoing itself. So people should not be freaked out about China. They should rather correct the idiocies committed in the West.
Well, I think when Tony Blair talks about the imbecilic desire to end endless wars, it should point out who the real imbecile is. And the people who are promoting these policies shouldn't be allowed to make policies. Maybe we should have a gaming room for people like Blair, but save the youth from it. Helga, just one final question then uh, comes up around this whole issue of where did this thing start? Where did the current involvement in Afghanistan start? And this still has to do with the fact that we don't have the real story on what happened on 9/11. The Schiller Institute will be sponsoring a conference on this next weekend, a week from this Saturday. Do you want to say something about that?
Yes. I mean, we have put out a white book on why the Afghanistan war should be ended. This was 2010, because, the very definition of why that war was started in the first place was based on a lie. The lie was that 9/11 was committed by bin Laden. The Taliban were giving refuge to bin Laden in Afghanistan, and that's why you have to punish the Taliban for having done that. Now, that story was ridiculous from the very beginning, because when 9/11 happened, it just happened to be that my late husband, Lyndon LaRouche, was listening, or not listening, he was conducting a live interview with a radio show in Utah of Jack Stockwell. And I remember it because, the news came, somebody put a piece of paper on his desk that the World Trade Center just had been hit. And without any recourse to any other, newspaper or report, he said, look, this could not have been done without the complicity of corrupt criminal elements of the US security apparatus, because he knew from his work on the SDI that, the air defense of the United States is such that you could never have done that from a cave from Afghanistan where some bearded bin Laden was sitting and directing the effort, it was a technical impossibility unless you had some, cooperation. And now we have the 20 years anniversary of 9/11, which is coming up. And there the question naturally will be the unfinished investigation about the role of Saudi Arabia, the cover up about that from the side of certain elements in the United States. And I think that that is something which has to be unearthed, because this war was started on the wrong basis and therefore could not have succeeded. And if you really want to have a paradigm shift, then that is what needs to be absolutely corrected. You have the 3,000 families of the victims of the World Trade Center who still are litigating against the Saudi government on that. And so that will be the subject of our next conference in about a week from now.
Well, people should look on the schillerinstitute.com website to sign up and register for that. Helga, I think we've run out of time. I want to thank you for joining us today, and we'll be back next week.
Yes, till next week, and join our efforts.